Hello and welcome to another episode of Politics Theory Other. My name is Alex Doherty and my guest today is Adrienne Buller. Last month, the UK was hit by a record-breaking heatwave, part of a wider climate event that affected much of Europe, whilst a subsequent and more severe heatwave hit South Asia, and unusually high spring temperatures have also been recorded in China, Japan and South Korea. To talk through the politics of heatwaves, I was joined by Adrienne Buller, editor of The Breakdown, which regularly produces fantastic analysis of all things related to capitalism, nature, and our increasingly disordered climate. We talked about the differential impacts of heatwaves, why it is that focus on climate in the media and even parts of the left has declined at the same time as the global climate situation has never been more severe. We also talked about climate adaptation in both more and less benign guises. And finally, we talked about the prospect of geoengineering and how close we might be to corporate and state actors deploying technologies such as stratospheric aerosol injection that aim to reduce inbound solar radiation. As always, if you find this interview useful, then please do consider becoming a £5 patron of the podcast. The show depends entirely upon listener support, and as well as keeping PTO going, you'll also get access to bonus content. You can support the show in pounds or whatever your local currency happens to be, and you can pledge any amount you choose. Go to patreon.com/polltheoryother to sign up. Adrienne Buller is the editor of The Breakdown and the author of The Value of a Whale on the Illusions of Green Capitalism. She's also the co-author with Matthew Lawrence of Owning the Future, Power and Property in an Age of Crisis. Her recent article in The Breakdown, which was the subject of our conversation, is titled Reflections on a Heatwave. So it might feel like an age ago now since the UK is currently experiencing the more sort of usual drizzle and heavy cloud cover. But just a couple of weeks back, the country was hit by a serious heatwave, highly unusual for the time of year, with temperatures getting up to 35 degrees in London. And this spring has apparently been the warmest on record for England and Wales and the third warmest for the UK as a whole. If the temperature is much more comfortable right now in the UK, that's of course not true elsewhere in the world, with North and Central India currently experiencing a severe heatwave, temperatures climbing to 46 degrees this week, apparently. When it comes to the actual experience of a heatwave, I was sort of thinking about when, my own sort of feelings changed about when hot weather hit, how that sort of changed at kind of just a sort of experiential level. And I think it's only in the last few years, really, when the needle is up to sort of 30 degrees, starting to find it sort of genuinely ominous and threatening in a way that, I certainly didn't experience very hot weather when I was younger. I guess it's partly the sense that the extent and the duration of the heat wave is probably, a mere foretaste of what we might be facing in the future, but also the knowledge that some people will die during the heat wave that's just gone, and that the heat wave we just experienced is also obviously pretty minor compared to heat waves elsewhere. We'll talk a bit more about the recent heat wave in a moment, but first I just wanted to ask, as someone who's so heavily involved in work around climate, how do you experience heat waves when they hit? What do you find yourself sort of focused on? What kind of thoughts preoccupy you?
Yeah, this is where I get outed as a classic doom and gloomer of the of the climate circles. No, I think, I always find it striking, and this is sort of a much belabored point by this point, but it is striking to me how invariably reporting on the heat waves just features kind of people at beaches and sort of jumping into the water as the sort of framing. And it kind of evokes what you were talking about there about sort of reflections of fun, hot summer days as a kid. But I think, like many people, including yourself, it sounds like now experience them very differently to that. I mean, maybe the best way to describe it is, the other week, the kind of day in the life experience I had of that heat wave, which is, I woke up in my apartment in central London, which is in the most kind of urban heat islands of urban heat islands. There are no trees on my street. It's concrete. I live in a building that is just big, old windows and thick walls that just hold the heat in. And I woke up having basically not slept because we also, in addition to the highs of the day, we had a tropical night for the first time, which is where it doesn't fall below 20 degrees Celsius overnight, which, if you don't have air conditioning or really a functional fan, poses real problems for sleeping. And then I live in a building that is mostly occupied by people who are about 70 plus. So our first step was just to actually text and sort of check on our families and friends and neighbors. And that's something I usually immediately think of. And then the thing that always strikes me in those is, imagining definitely the most vulnerable, but also thinking about the fact that we have infrastructural systems that are just built for a completely different era, and something I think probably a lot of people were affected by without maybe realizing that it was related to the heat wave is just that our transit systems cannot cope with that scale of heat, because you get the risk of the rails kind of superheating, expanding, buckling, which could cause derailments, but also the kind of electrical wires above trains will sag in the heat. And so you can also get those torn off. And so loads of train services around the UK had to impose either cancellations or major reductions in the speed at which trains could run. And so loads of people couldn't get to where they needed to go, were late for work, and all the rest. And so I kind of just wander about the city thinking about all of these infrastructures that we have that are just radically kind of ill-equipped for the world that we now live in.
Yes, and just going back to the point about the way in which heat waves are covered, and as you say, it's images of people at the beach, it's people in swimming pools, it's all that kind of stuff. Is part of the reason that persists that there is this sort of this difficulty in easily determining, or at least quickly determining, the number of deaths that are attributable to high temperatures. It's not immediately calculable. Typically, people don't die directly from heat exposure, although obviously there have been such cases, particularly in the construction industry in some parts of the world. But rather, deaths are often due to other health conditions that are exacerbated by the heat, and it can take quite some time to get the data showing that.
Yeah, I think it's less about a kind of, I guess, time lag between the event itself and then when we can sort of confirm that there were deaths related to this heat wave. I think we've had so many, and the kind of evidence of the links between heat waves and various heat related deaths is so robust already that, that isn't necessarily, I think, the problem for me. I think what makes this so difficult, and, this is a much bigger question we can maybe get into, but climate change has a real scale problem when it comes to thinking about it and communicating it. And that applies both at the kind of temporal level that we're talking about. So this kind of distance between its causes, its impacts, and the kind of targets we set, which feel very distant into the future. But also at a kind of scale level. So we've got this kind of translation of these quite abstract sort of global targets like 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius at a global level. And then how that filters down into really discrete and quite variable impacts at the local level. And it's really hard, I think, even for people who think about this all the time, to wrap your head around that. There are all sorts of complex relationships in weather systems, and people are, I think, wary of jumping to saying, oh, climate change caused this heat wave, because there are so many causal links that you'll quickly get people who are interested in sort of denying it jumping on and saying, oh, you can't prove that. And, El Nino is a big part of what's happening this year in particular, which is part of kind of normal weather variations. But all these things are linked. And so I think there's a real understandable wariness about kind of making immediate claims. But I do think we're at the point where we just need to start doing that. And we do know, in the world, the last 10 hottest years were the past 10 years. There's no kind of ambiguity about the circumstances in which we find ourselves. And I think being really affirmative about those links is really important at this stage. But there's been a real kind of berating of people over time of jumping to conclusions too fast. And this is where the work of groups like the World Weather Attribution Group, based out of Imperial, and led by Dr. Friederike Otto, is really valuable. They do a lot of kind of rapid response attribution of extreme events to climate, and that's a relatively nascent field. And she's sort of a lightning rod for all sorts of denialists. But I think that's a really necessary undertaking at this stage.
Yes, I mean, one data point that I saw regarding the recent heat wave and heat waves in spring in England was that 9 of the 10 warmest springs in England have occurred since 2007. So obviously, even if we can't necessarily attribute an individual case to climate change, the fact that there is this trend is obviously pretty conclusive. You write in your article about how, despite the heat wave and the escalating dangers of climate change, that the subject has, as you put it, faded from the concerns of mainstream politics. Why is that, in your opinion? Why is climate change losing its salience at a moment where its effects are more obvious and more destructive than they've ever been? And do you see this as a dynamic that has developed across the board internationally, or is it something that's more specific to the UK?
Great question. There's definitely a lot at play, but maybe it's just helpful to start with a statistic on this point, which is that there's a recent kind of study by the University of Colorado looking at global media coverage of the climate crisis. And they found that in the 5 years since 2021, it's dropped by over a third and actually closer to like 40%. I think it was 38% or something. And that's really, really significant. Now, that's not to say that just mentioning climate and doing climate stories is, the work of addressing the climate crisis. Obviously, that's just one small part of it. But I think it's a really interesting indicator of how much it's receded from political and public discourse. And I mean, the major broadcasters in the US are particularly at fault here. So in the first year of Trump's second term, they cut their climate coverage by 35% just in a single year, just sort of overnight in response to his presidency. And that's maybe a good place to start. In somewhere like the US, this second term under Trump has definitely been one in which a willingness to pursue and prosecute and vilify and go after anyone sort of pursuing messages that the administration or the president personally is averse to, that willingness is really clear. And so I think there has been a real sense of fear around being on the receiving end of those attacks. And climate in particular, they're very keen to emphasize the importance of maximizing U.S. exploitation of fossil fuels, of denying the climate crisis, and all the rest. And so I think there's been a sort of cowardly at times, but also understandable reaction to a sense of political persecution in the US and many other places. But I think there's also a lot more going on. I mean, people spend a lot of time thinking back to the height of the climate movement in 2019, the kind of Extinction Rebellion era, the sort of Fridays for Future era, when you had massive movements on the street, which, controversial as they may have been, did significantly move the dial in terms of people's perspectives on the urgency of the climate crisis. And there were a lot of public polls that kind of showed that. The pandemic and various other factors halted that. And then you had, I think, rightly, a shift of sort of focus to a lot of other really urgent crises over the past years, the kind of genocide in Gaza being the most salient. And I think a lot of the same people who were doing the work of making noise around the climate crisis are also now kind of allocating that energy, rightfully, to other urgent issues. And again, this comes back to my point previously that climate change really suffers from this scale problem, which is that it's communicated so often as a long-term problem of sort of distal targets, 2050, 2100, all these kind of time frames of some imagined apocalyptic future that we'll one day arrive at, rather than this kind of slow, steady accumulation of acute crises and this background condition of drastic change. And so in confrontation with events of immediate devastating urgency, like Gaza or now the assault on Iran, rightfully, it sort of falls to background conditions, as well as the kind of Russian invasion of Ukraine, which created a whole set of new dynamics in the energy system around fossil fuels in particular. And so there's been this kind of coterie of really big challenges that I think have understandably caused climate to recede as an issue, but they're intimately linked to the question of the climate crisis, particularly to the question of the global fossil fuel industry and the kind of preservation of that industry and its power and its wealth. So that's been, I guess, quite interesting to watch. And I definitely think it's happening at a global level rather than just in the UK. One of the lines that I think summed it up really well was I did an interview with David Wallace Wells for the third issue of The Breakdown. And he basically put it as, we live in a time in which the leaders of the global north have effectively decided that climate change isn't going to be all that problematic. And his take was that it's a sort of self-interested calculation that has to do with the fact that we are moving at a pace that is nowhere near how quickly we need to be moving to do anything like mitigation. And by that, I mean to sort of stay within, 1.5 degrees Celsius we're already basically there. It's 1.4. So more looking now at 2 degrees, which was meant to be the kind of upper bound, as something that may even not be achievable, definitely not on the pathways we're on. And so, an understanding that kind of that way they've failed, we've failed, seems to be kind of filtering into the political calculation that a lot of people in power are making. And, you know, lastly, I would say, on the point of those of us who work in kind of climate advocacy, I think there is a real sense both of exhaustion, but also just a bit of, I guess, of confusion or rudderlessness is maybe the way to put it. And I would definitely identify that as a feeling that I have of however we've been communicating this problem doesn't seem to be working. Talking about climate change as this kind of large scale, very technical scientific background condition with a kind of 2 degrees global temperature rise, it doesn't seem to be working to speak about it in that way. But how we replace that is still open to contestation. And so maybe it's now emerging in the discourse, and we can come to that maybe in very different ways. So rather than talking about climate change overtly, it's filtering through in other issues like, say, the cost of living. And I think, there's probably really valid reasons for that.
And just going back to that point you make about the chilling effect of the Trump administration on the US media in particular, I mean, I suppose there is a sort of dual effect with Trump where it's both the coerciveness directed at the media, threatening them with consequences if they do pay attention to things that are contrary to the interests of the administration, but also just the way the Trump administration operates, right? It's so relentlessly active. It's the entire mentality and the strategy is very much that sort of move fast and break things. They're always doing things.
Flood
There's
the
always
zone kind of tactic.
exactly,
Yeah.
and therefore, obviously, it incentivizes the media to focus on whatever crazy thing is being done at any particular given point in time. And obviously, that stuff does need to be covered, right? So
Yeah.
you can see the dilemma.
Yeah. I also just to add to that, I think as well, and this, pertains to some of the work that I used to really focus on, which was kind of the finance sector and sort of green finance in particular. It's been really revealing as well, which is something we kind of always knew to be true, but that I think people were happy to kind of be slightly Pollyannish about, which is that, when you had this surge of interest in like ESG and green finance and corporate sustainability and different news channels having a climate program in this era in which there was major demand politically in terms of social movements, etc., a few years back. All of that, I think, has been very clearly revealed to have been utterly kind of hollow and shallow, and not something that we could ever have relied upon. And as soon as media organizations or financial institutions, corporations, etc., were given the permission not to have to worry about those issues, they really leapt at it. And I think that gets to the heart of the issue when it comes to climate, which is that capital's interests are not really in addressing this in the near term. And I think if there's an upshot to any of that, it's to really have exposed that quite nakedly when it comes to the fallout from Trump too. It's that these actors, these interests they were never on your side. And I suppose that would be the one, I guess, silver lining.
On the point you make about whether or not messaging and campaigning around climate should be more tied into other sort of social issues. So the Green Party in England and Wales, under the leadership of Zach Polanski, has been heavily criticised by much of the media for the perceived shift away from a focus on climate and the environment and towards more emphasis on things like the cost of living crisis and foreign policy. Obviously, a lot of that criticism is very unfair and often disingenuous. There's certainly been no watering down of the Greens' actual policies on climate, and the shift towards talking about the cost of living seems to be an intelligent move. It's one that's resulting in electoral success for the Greens. But given the success that they've achieved at this point, and given that the name recognition and the sort of megaphone that Zach Polanski now has, do you think the Greens actually could be saying a bit more on the climate crisis at the moment, and particularly during the heat wave?
This is a really interesting one, and I'll start by saying that I am definitely not a political strategist. I think I would be terrible in that job. um,
Same here.
but yeah, it's really interesting to watch because the coalition that the Greens are now building under Polanski feels very, very different to the coalition that many people would associate a kind of traditional capital G Greens party with, which is kind of politically actually a kind of broad church that would include a lot of kind of more conservative voters who love the English countryside, etc. And now they've taken a very different tack to become the kind of party for progressives in the UK, with the sort of collapse of that in other parties, notably Labour. And I think that is a smart move. And to my point previously, I think it is really important to be communicating climate change as directly and intimately related to all the other challenges that people are politically animated by, whether that's the cost of living, which obviously right now is the most salient, whether it's, some of the impetus behind global wars, although obviously there are incredibly complex reasons for those, whether it's collective public hatred of our crumbling and failing privatized water companies, for example. All of these things are climate issues. And I think it's really smart to be focusing on those issues. But I do think that your point there is really interesting, which is that I do worry about the complete elision of climate as a word, as a term, as an issue from that advocacy. And I think with the momentum that they have, there's really important work now to be done of making those connections very clear and of building new constituencies, political constituencies around climate as an issue and new allies. They could have a real base among, farmers in the UK, for example. And in lieu of hostile farmers' protests that were among kind of inheritance tax in various countries around the world have also protested various climate and carbon emission related policies. You could be building a real coalition around the threats that sector faces from climate change and biodiversity loss, the leading role that they could play in both mitigation and adaptation. There's a lot to be done there, and I do think you kind of have to name climate for that to work. Same goes for the cost of living, for our energy system, for pressures on the health system, for workers' rights. Lots of manual labor jobs are most exposed to the impacts of climate, and one of the biggest things we need to be doing when it comes to adaptation is changing the way we work, looking at working hours, working conditions. These are all things where climate is a direct and incredibly salient, important factor. And there would be a missed opportunity in my mind not to campaign on that. Now, whether that needs to happen at global broadcast media level by talking about climate all the time is a different question. But when you're thinking about that kind of localized coalition building, I think there's a real opportunity there that they should absolutely take advantage of. And I think always back to that kind of maybe too oft repeated Stuart Hall quote, which is that politics doesn't reflect majorities, it constructs them. And I think that is really essential when it comes to climate. And we've clearly not been getting that right, particularly in the past couple of years, but that they have a real opportunity there to do that.
Just going back to the heat wave for a moment and the effects of heat waves. So the impacts of heat waves are, of course, not felt equally. Poorer and racialized people are more likely, for instance, to have to work outside in the heat. They're less likely to live in well-ventilated homes. Those homes are more likely to be cramped. Poorer areas typically have less tree cover and so on. Could you talk a bit about the differential impacts of heat waves and what could be done to ameliorate that problem?
I mean, everything you say there is absolutely correct. And that is something that is so painful about the climate crisis, which is that both domestically and internationally, its impacts are so differently felt. And there's this real kind of direct coalface between climate impacts and sort of class and a number of other kind of indicators of who you are and where you stand, I guess, in society. And there's so many ways that you might be more affected by being poor or being working class or being a racialized minority. And, you're less likely, as you said, to have air conditioning. You're more likely to live in an urban heat island. Probably you're more likely to have a job that requires you to work in hotter, more physically trying conditions. You might have worse access to healthcare, and you're more likely probably to use public transit and to need to commute to work, all these things. Oh, you're more likely to spend more of your monthly budget on food, which is directly linked to climate impacts. And, there's so many ways that adaptation could resolve or address all of those inequalities in a way that not only speaks to, I guess, concerns about climate justice, but also, again, kind of builds that sense of community and that kind of political coalition around these interventions, which would very directly make people's lives better, redress a number of the kind of inequalities that we see, and create, I think, potentially a greater sense of community. And there's adaptation proposals. They range from the kind of very macro to the micro and very localized. There's a lot of proposals. If you look at the sort of Committee on Climate Change proposals, those are very much looking at the kind of national government level, and looking at things like resilience in our kind of water system. So the fact that we are woefully ill-equipped when it comes to reservoirs, but also massive leakage in our water systems.
Because of lack of investment in the infrastructure.
Well, exactly. And we're wasting 1 trillion liters of water annually just to leakage in our water systems. I mean, that is astonishing. It's 3 billion liters a day. And it's worth saying that there's estimates that by 2050, we're looking at about 5 billion liters per day shortfall of water relative to demand by 2050 under like the 2 degrees of warming pathway, which is an optimistic pathway at this point. So that's a major shortage, and that would be partly redressed by fixing our ailing privatized water system, but other interventions will be necessary. And there's all sorts of kind of localized interventions at the city level, at the kind of town level, like tree planting, creating urban public cooling centers so that people who otherwise live in sort of baking homes or maybe unhoused can access cool public spaces, investing in more parks, as I said, more tree cover, all sorts of things that are really important climate interventions, but also that people really like. Like, people do just really like a lot of these interventions. And I do think that they could also give a greater sense of community, which I think is really needed as a political tool in not only this context in which decades of neoliberalism have kind of eroded our sense of connectedness to each other, our sense that collective effort can achieve things. That seems like a very deliberate intervention, but also that in response to a lot of what is coming down the line, you need to have collective community flood plans, emergency responses. You need to have heat plans like they've done in Montreal in Canada, where I'm from, around heat strategies that filter down to the local level to make sure that neighbors are looking out for each other, that they know where to go in instances of extreme heat or other weather events. All these kinds of things that I think are great from a climate level, from an inequality level, but also from a kind of political strategy level. If what you care about is rebuilding coalition for progressive policy. And so adaptation for a long time, I think, was like the kind of forgotten or deliberately ignored child of climate politics and people working on climate. There was this sense that talking about it was bad political strategy because it
It's
kind
sort of defeatist, right? Like,
it sounded
it
defeatist.
implies
Is
that
it
you're not going to do anything about emissions. So
exactly, you know, you've given up on emissions, so we're turning to adaptation. And at times, definitely certain people have proposed that, but also this sense that it could, mitigation was the key task, and we can't divert any funds, any energy, any attention toward other things, and that it was kind of throwing up your hands and saying that we failed. Obviously, that just no longer stands as a stance, not only because of where we are on the climate trajectory and how far we still have to go when it comes to decarbonizing, but also because I think people increasingly recognize it has always been like a yes and rather than an either or. And there's, you know, a growing kind of argument and a growing sort of body of evidence that adaptation, rather than decreasing kind of public demand for mitigation for the work of decarbonizing, can actually really increase it. And again, that's this sense of creating this understanding of the localized impacts of climate on oneself, one's home, one's community, one's town, city, etc., that is really important because it can feel, as I mentioned before, so abstract at the kind of temporal and spatial scale. And so by creating a sense of the fact that people and communities can act, by translating it to a more tangible understanding, and by frankly just like reminding people that we're in a climate crisis in all of these ways rather than taking away, I think adaptation can really help grow progress for mitigation as well.
Yes, and I suppose a lot of the things that could be implemented, I mean, it's not pie in the sky in the sense that a lot of this stuff is being done in other countries. Some of the techniques, you mentioned the example of Montreal, for example, this stuff is happening and wouldn't be that hard to do in many cases.
Yeah, a lot of it is relatively straightforward. I mean, whether it's, again, reducing urban heat islands with tree planting, but also a lot of, and I hate this term, but I'll use it because it's just convenient right now, which is sort of nature-based solutions, which is things like restoring fens, salt marshes, wetlands around coastal England to reduce erosion and flooding. Those are things, again, that people really like. People tend to like, nature in their local area, and it's great for biodiversity, but also for addressing the risks of climate impacts without needing to, build massive walls and dikes. And, we'll have to do that in certain places. But there's a lot of relatively straightforward interventions that could both make people's lives better in the near term and more resilient in the long term. And the same goes for agriculture as well. When it comes to farming, there's a lot of immediate sort of changes that could be made that would both improve biodiversity and improve kind of soil resilience while also improving the resilience of farmers and farms themselves to periods of extreme drought. I mean, last year was devastating for UK farmers. There was a 10% reduction in their output over the average in a single year. And it was, hundreds of millions of pounds of losses for farms across the UK. And obviously you can't mitigate against the entirety of that, but there's a lot of changes we could make to how we think about the way we produce food, who we produce it for, where it goes. That would be great for everyone, farmers and I guess food consumers and biodiversity all included. And yeah, part of it also comes down, as I said, to the kind of creation of public spaces and plans in local communities for things like heat waves. If there are a lot more kind of free public cool spaces for people to go to, shaded parks, etc., I think the experience of those heat waves would be a lot better. Some of it is harder, absolutely, major infrastructural projects related to the energy and transport and water systems. But those are things that, again, aren't just in response to climate, but will make all those services better in and of themselves.
Going back to your article, so you write that what is particularly worrying is the marriage of an opposition to climate action with hardening perspectives on the border, alongside ethno-nationalism and a racist Malthusianism and exclusion as the foundation of ecological stability. None of this is new, but what is unique about this moment is the extent to which far-right narratives have moved the political centre, driving politics toward a future in which perceptions of scarcity, hardship, and zero-sum competition draw sharp lines between those whose lives are worth protecting and those whose are not. Can you talk a bit more about that and how opposition to climate action can actually go hand in hand with adaptation practices that would protect certain populations whilst sacrificing and excluding others?
Climate change and its impacts are the kind of perfect wedge or the perfect prism through which the parties of the far right, sort of ethno-nationalist parties, can stake their claims on the need to sort of protect native populations, to protect the borders, to protect the homeland, because climate is creating, as a crisis, all sorts of impacts that perfectly kind of support that narrative, whether it's something like the cost of living crisis, strains on resources, flows of people from parts of the world that are most exposed to climate impacts, and this sense of a kind of like mysterious global elite who wants to take away hardworking industrial jobs and bring in some kind of great reset world order. Although that's, at the fringe of most politics, but definitely a current in lots of kind of far right fringes. But all of those things together kind of combine to provide this sense of justification for pulling up the drawbridge and protecting one's own. And by failing to do mitigation, by failing to cut fossil fuels out of the system, all of those impacts will become increasingly sharp, increasingly acute. And so that kind of narrative around protecting one's own, around a zero-sum game, scarcity of resources, pressure on all of our systems like housing, et cetera, that really form the kind of central plank of a lot of the narratives of someone like a Farage, will become more acute over time. And so adaptation then enters in a number of quite complex ways. And we've talked a lot about adaptation as being these kind of interventions to make, life in hot cities more bearable or to make farming systems more resilient. those are all forms of adaptation. But adaptation can also be understood in very different ways to that, right? Adaptation means any kind of shifting response in how we organize our societies and economies in relation to the climate crisis. And so you could see a very particular brand of adaptation as being really hard borders, and that being a kind of method through which to manage impacts on resources in those kinds of strains through the deliberate and violent exclusion of the wrong kind of people. And I think whether or not that's deliberately tied to climate as a narrative by lots of far-right parties, it's definitely a form of how they may be thinking about this problem. This kind of Mike Davis idea from his Who Will Build the Ark essay of these green and gated oases on an otherwise stricken planet. It's this kind of image I always come back to. And in the case of the UK, there's a really strong resonance there. And we have a sort of essay on the breakdown that explores this a bit between that kind of idea of the kind of green and pleasant land, the kind of verdant English homeland that needs to be protected. And there's a real ecological dimension to that sense of protecting the environmentally pristine homeland from kind of foreign invaders. And so the hard borders in response to climate impacts narrative and perspective is one that I find particularly sort of terrifying, and that seems to have a lot of support both in the UK but also across a lot of Europe. And it's a message that has been made both explicit and implicitly. You know, you had, although she's now out, but Marine Le Pen was very fond of drawing a relationship between borders and environmentalism. There are various parties that have done so. And so that would be a very particular and horrific form of some degree of adaptation. There are also, at the smaller scale, interventions that domestically would have really kind of unequal impacts and sharpen the line between the sort of haves and have-nots when it comes to climate impacts. And it's in their recent book, The Long Heat, Andreas Malm and Wim Carton document a lot of these, and they call it sort of muscular adaptationism, which is this sort of very technology-forward approach to responding to climate change, which is that modernity is all just about separating ourselves from the impacts of the environment. And they document a lot of these kind of efforts. And one of them is this kind of very evocative story of the Battle of Sainte-Soline, which is in France. And it's against this thing, a word I never thought I'd read so many times in my life, but mega bassines, which are these proposals for huge reservoirs in kind of ecological but water-stressed areas in France. And they would be stupid in many ways from a kind of water preservation standpoint. They'd be sort of siphoning water from local streams and runoff from fields into these huge basins that are more exposed to evaporation, but they'd both be devastating to local ecologies that depend on those streams and water systems, but also to a particular class of kind of local agricultural community who, you know, the proposal is for these basins to have taps effectively for very specific users, mostly kind of large agricultural firms, many of whom are exporting a majority of their food abroad and not being available to local farming communities. And so there's these real kinds of tensions, again, between the interests of globalized capital, local communities. And so there's all sorts of ways that adaptation could be done very harmfully. And I think that applies both at the kind of domestic sort of intra-class and intra-community level, but also, of course, at the global level, with the greatest version of that being a kind of harsh pulling up of the drawbridge, Fortress Europe kind of approach to how we respond to climate impacts.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point, because I guess in a way, the promise of the far right is the creation of a bordered, protected oases, as you sort of describe. And obviously that would be a sort of stratified globe of that nature, where certain parts of the world would be protected and other parts sacrificed. Is obviously in and of itself horrific. But we also know that's not how it would play out, right? There would also be stratification within societies. You know, we already see a certain form of stratified adaptation happening within societies in the global north. Just the fact that wealthy people are able to purchase air conditioning units and therefore sort of insulate themselves from the impacts of heat waves and so on.
Yeah, and they can commute in air-conditioned cars. They can afford to buy healthier food that becomes more and more expensive as time goes on. They work in jobs in, you know, air-conditioned offices in the City of London. You know, at every level, these kind of inequalities filter down. And that definitely applies within the UK. It applies, I mean, there was this insane statistic that I saw recently about Cape Town, which is extremely water stressed, and also because of the legacy of apartheid, designed around massive inequality as a city. There was something like the richest 10 or 15% of the population of that city consumes more than half of all water, or has in recent years, in the midst of this kind of like record drought. And it's just that people can afford to access things at different levels. And as all these systems come under strain, that will only become more sharp. And this is, again, why we would want something like our water systems to be in public ownership, right? It's not just about the fact that that is maybe a principle that we might hold, or we don't just want to be nostalgic and look back to a different era. It's just that these are systems that are going to come under increasing strain, that are essential to life and well-being. And they've been both radically underinvested in, but also the private corporate form is not set up to handle the delivery of human need, particularly in times of crisis, pressure, strain, challenge. They do okay when like it's a time of bounty and everything's fine. But as we're looking down the barrel of increasing pressures and challenges related to droughts, heat waves, flooding in the winters, how we manage much wetter, rainier winters in the UK, which is another part of what we're facing in the climate crisis. All of these things are just not set up to be handled by an institutional form whose overall disciplining force is profitability. And that's not even like a critique of the company. It's just like that is what it's set up to do.
You mentioned in the article that in recent months you've been researching for a podcast series on the topic of geoengineering. And of course, the Breakdown has published work on the subject, in particular on solar geoengineering, including a very good article by Sophia Menamenlis, who appeared on PTO actually to talk about that article. How far along are projects for geoengineering at this point? Who are the key players, and how far away do you think we are from an attempt at deploying geoengineering at scale?
Yeah, great question. And it's worth saying, this is, although it's not typically sort of couched under adaptation, this very much would fit into what we were just talking about different ways of understanding how we respond to the climate crisis. And geoengineering, for those who didn't listen to that episode, although I highly recommend it, Sophia's very brilliant. It's a way to deliberately intervene in the kind of earth and climate systems in order to manage the effects, the impacts of the climate crisis. And so we've been focusing in this investigative series that I've been developing with the excellent Jeff Mann, who's based in Canada. And we've been focusing on solar geoengineering as well. And there's lots of reasons for that. But one of which is that although it sounds like the most, I guess, sci-fi of these interventions, and so just to describe it, it's basically proposals mostly to fly kind of specialized jets high in the upper layers of the atmosphere, in the stratosphere, to distribute reflective particles to reflect incoming sunlight and change the radiative forcing that drives climate change and global warming. And it sounds in some ways the most sci-fi and kind of outlandish, as I say, but in practice, it's actually maybe one of the forms of geoengineering that is technologically nearest at hand. And that is a learning from the series and the kind of work we've been doing for both Jeff and I, although I don't want to speak for him, but that has been one of the biggest, I guess, surprises and perspectives that I've had to personally shift, which is that a lot of the experts that we've spoken to feel very confident in saying that, at least from a technological perspective, we are a couple of years out from this. And some of the major developments this year have been with this US-Israeli firm called Stardust Solutions, who we spoke to for the series. And they have just released a whole slate of documentation of the kind of proprietary reflective particle that they've been developing. So basically trying to create a sort of patented substance, which is what would be sort of sprayed into the sky to reflect incoming sunlight. And they've been trying to develop a version of this that sort of minimizes some of the impacts that a kind of previously proposed substances might have. And scientists have lots of disagreement as to whether or not they've achieved that. But it's interesting to me and very significant that we have a private company with major backing from, in particular, a Canadian investment firm called AWZ Ventures, with a lot of former military personnel in its advisory group and board and membership that are really interested in this. So I think that in practice, definitely, it's a lot closer than I had previously expected. And politically, I watch our failure to mitigate climate change with horror and sadness for many reasons. But among them now, increasingly, is this real sense that because it's technologically feasible, there are fewer and fewer barriers to the deployment of this technology, but that it is a technology whose deployment and governance is more complex from a politics perspective than maybe anything that we've ever done, at least from a global governance perspective, because this is kind of like nuclear warfare, although in different ways. This is an intervention that could be deployed unilaterally by one country, probably by a military apparatus because of some of the engineering-related complexities of it. But that it could be done unilaterally, but it invariably and immediately has global implications. And that it's something that in order to function, to achieve some of the goals that people have set out about how you might use it to sort of limit temperatures. This is decades, if not hundreds of years of deployment of this technology that requires complex global governance. And that is a challenge on the scale of something that we've kind of never done, to think not only about the global scale, the planetary scale and implications, but also the incredibly long time horizons that we have to be thinking about how you would govern this. And there's so many risks to what would happen if you failed at that governance once it had started, in terms of what's called, the termination shock, which is if it sort of were to suddenly stop being deployed, and the kind of rapid warming that you'd see in response to that, and all sorts of other implications. So in answer to your question, yes, we are, I think, closer than a lot of people would like to think, although, whether or not someone actually does it is a very different question. And people that we've spoken to have very different answers on that, but there's a lot of forward momentum on it. And it's a really strange, frightening, fascinating thing that we could experience in the not too distant future.
The comparison you make with, I assume you meant nuclear war, right?
Yes.
Yeah, because I guess another comparison when it comes to nuclear, it might not be actual nuclear war, but also nuclear testing, right? Which in some ways very similar in a democratic sense, an absolute outrage, something that the nuclear powers simply inflicted upon the globe and particular regions without the say of anyone else. In some cases that was very direct and impact of people near to the testing zones who were affected, but also just the lofting of nuclear substances into the atmosphere, which then had, certain effects further down the line. But that would be something very similar, but obviously on a much smaller scale compared to solar geoengineering.
Yeah, and I think it's important just to clarify, I draw that comparison because it's maybe one of the few other technologies that, as I said, you could kind of unilaterally deploy that has a truly planetary impact. I think there is another thing we've learned is that there's a real sense of misunderstanding about the potential for this technology to be sort of weaponized. And that's a word that gets thrown around in a lot of criticism of it. And it's not, we did speak to one person who really conceived of it as a potential weapon and therefore something that the US government should be sort of pursuing. And this was a sort of Republican strategist that we spoke to. And there's a lot of right-wing think tanks in the US publishing papers about weather sovereignty and these kinds of things and why the US needs to get out in front. And all of that's very alarming. But it's not, because you are changing almost inherently the global climate. This is a planetary scale intervention. You can't just, once these substances enter the stratosphere, they get whipped around by incredibly powerful, fast-moving stratospheric winds. And you're creating a sort of reflective layer broadly, globally, although obviously with some kind of variations in concentration in different places. And so you can't sort of deploy this and say, it's not like sort of localized weather interventions, which are also tools that we have and have used regularly for decades. But this is a kind of planetary climatic intervention where you can't just sort of point a laser beam, if you're the US, at like Russia and say like, we're going to change Russia's climate and then like gobble up all the good climate for ourselves. That's not is not how this works. Although, if you were to deploy it just in the northern or just in the southern hemisphere, there are potentially really significant risks from that, because there's these sort of belts at the tropics that would actually sort of limit the distribution of it between the northern and southern hemisphere if you only deployed in one of those. And that could have really significant impacts on climate and weather systems. And in that sense, you could, I suppose, if you were really kind of going for a major self-own, deploy it in a single hemisphere. But it does have all sorts of uncertain or unknown, unmeasurable impacts on global weather systems, on things like the South Asian monsoon, which impacts the livelihoods and lives of billions of people on this planet, all sorts of potential ecological impacts, all of these questions that we really can't know until we deploy it at scale. And so in that sense, that's maybe a better way to understand quote unquote weaponization, right? Is that it's this massive intervention with either uncertain or unknowable risks that, once you get going can be really difficult or risky to turn off, and which could be monopolized by a single great power. And so there's all sorts of questions, I guess, tied up in it. But I just wanted to clarify that rather than suggesting that it could be sort of deployed like a nuclear warhead. But again, it's a technology where there could be real sort of certain winners and losers distributed in different places around the globe because of how it will impact the climate system. You're not getting the same climate back. So, you get to 2 degrees, you deploy solar geoengineering, you wind the clock back to 1 degrees. You're not getting the climate we had at 1 degrees. You're adding yet another perturbation to the climate system. And so you're not getting what we had before. You're getting a cooler planet, but also one in which distributions of weather systems are changed. And so there will be winners and losers from that. And that's a very alarming, unpredictable set of conditions.
Okay, well, on the topic of alarming and unpredictable, so it's sort of a bit of a convention, I think, of left podcasts or left wing books, even to finish on an optimistic note. But we're not going to do that. We're going to talk about something really absolutely terrifying. So last week we saw reporting on the weakening and possible collapse of the AMOC, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation. This is the system of currents that transports warmth from the tropics to Europe, and that reporting discussed the presence of a quote-unquote cold blob located southeast of Greenland, which is in the one region where the Earth's surface has actually been cooling. How important is this story, and what would be the consequences of a severe weakening or collapse of the AMOC?
I mean, look, it's not going to be good. I'm gonna level with you, Alex. It's not going to be good.
Yeah.
This is a really interesting one. This is a big kind of like climate community fixation, I think rightly. And the way it gets reported a lot is this kind of like, oh, it's going to be the day after tomorrow in Britain, because if you were to have a significant and prolonged slowing of this current, it would create really, really cool conditions for the UK, quite extreme conditions, even in the context of rising global heating. So the AMOC, just to step back a bit, it is one of the major kind of ocean conveyor belt currents, and it's driven both by water and air temperatures, but also by the salinity of the ocean. And so it's a really important current that not only drives things like the Gulf Stream, which is a component of it, which is, as you described, bringing that kind of warmer air and water from the Gulf of Mexico toward Europe, and is a big part of why we have this green and pleasant land, why we have sort of arability and for farming and agriculture and sort of tolerable conditions in much of Europe. But it also is really important for the sort of fertilization of the ocean, the kind of overturning of currents that make life viable in the ocean, that enable the ocean to capture as much carbon as it has. Global oceans are responsible for about 30%. They've consumed or sort of trapped about 30% of human-produced emissions since the dawn of the industrial age. We'd be so much worse off if the oceans weren't absorbing that much carbon. Now, that said, that's also driven a degree of ocean acidification, which is its own problem. But all of these things are incredibly important when it comes to the climate and the world and the weather systems, the Earth systems that we've all been fortunate enough to live within. And so there's strong evidence that that current is slowing. And this is a sort of feed-forward loop with global temperature rise, because what you get is more melting of the ice in the Arctic, which means that you get this plunging of kind of cold and fresh rather than salty water into the ocean. And again, because this is a current driven by both temperature and salinity, that becomes this kind of feed-forward loop where the contrasts are reduced and you get a slowing of this current. And yeah, it's a really significant problem. It's proposed to be one of these kind of global tipping points where after a certain degree of kind of slowing, there is no kind of returning it to its original state. You almost go off this kind of cliff edge where it's now in this kind of new stable state that, while it's stable for the current, creates massive instability for the planet and the weather systems that we occupy. And there's disagreement over the likelihood of a full kind of collapse, as people like to call it, a real kind of drastic, endured slowing. But much like a lot of climate science that we read, the changes in how we understand that likelihood, it's very rare that you see a paper that revises that expectation down in terms of likelihood. What we tend to see is every new kind of bit of research seems to suggest that it could be nearer or more likely than we expect. And so there's real implications for the UK there. But again, these circulation patterns are absolutely vital for things like the tropical monsoons that are responsible for the kind of viability of life for billions of people on Earth. It would be related to the kind of dieback of the Amazon rainforest, again, by impacting weather conditions there. And so there's this kind of like cascade of potentially catastrophic effects from the slowing of this current. And it is very directly related to global temperature rise. And so it's a real concern when we think about the kind of stability and viability of human life and non-human life as we know it. And while I'm not projecting glaciers and igloos in London anytime soon, which is sometimes the images that you see on like the cover of the Daily Mail reporting of this, it's a really potentially terrifying impact that rightly, I think, is a major concern of the scientific community right now. And because it exemplifies, I think, these feedback loops and tipping points that are the real kind of concern of climate science, rather than this kind of aggregate like 2 degrees metric that we tend to hear over and over. These are the kinds of changes, this ground level variability, that is going to be the real driver of the change and the impacts that will make a difference to human and non-human life.
You've been listening to Politics Theory Other. If you've been enjoying PTO and finding it useful, then please do consider becoming a £5 supporter on Patreon. The show depends entirely on listener support, and if you sign up, you can access bonus content, including listener questions episodes with PTO guests. Go to patreon.com/poletheoryother to sign up. The show's music and graphic design is produced by Planet B Productions. Thanks as ever for listening. I'll be back soon.